Although my family's really nice, Edward isn't necessarily the type of guy that they would normally choose for me.
Relationships begin and relationships end, and that may very well happen to them. Oh well.
Marissa walks into the courtroom with one promise in her head. She will not cry in front of Edward, the attorneys, or the strangers sorting through a marriage she once believed still had a future. Her face stays controlled as she takes her seat, but every movement looks careful because Edward is already across the room and refuses to meet her eyes. He keeps his attention on the table, his shoulders tight and his expression unreadable, while folders, records, and phone logs sit only a few feet away. Marissa does not know every detail waiting inside those pages yet, but she knows enough to understand this hearing will not be about one bad night. Somewhere inside those records is a message capable of changing everything which came before, and neither of them is prepared for how much damage one line will carry. Only weeks earlier, the marriage did not look finished from the outside. The relationship looked strained, tired, and full of arguments neither person knew how to solve, but Marissa still believed they had not reached the point of no return. Money had become a regular source of tension. Family opinions had found their way into private disagreements. Edward had started speaking more openly about feeling judged, as if every choice he made was being measured against expectations he never agreed to. Marissa heard those complaints because their problems were bigger than one fight. She also knew suspicion would pour more pressure onto a marriage already struggling to breathe, so when Edward's behavior around his phone began to change, she forced herself to notice without accusing. At first, the difference was small enough to dismiss. Edward started keeping his phone closer than before, turning the screen away when messages arrived and carrying the device with him during moments when he used to leave the phone sitting nearby. Marissa noticed late-night alerts, then noticed how quickly some conversations disappeared after Edward read them. Calls arrived at odd hours, sometimes followed by quiet explanations about work, business contacts, or loose ends from the day. None of those details proved betrayal, and Marissa knew as much. She did not want to search for guilt in every vibration or glance at a screen when their marriage already contained enough resentment. Then the explanations started rubbing against details she learned later. Edward would say a meeting ran late, yet another piece of information would make the timing feel wrong. He would mention work, then become vague when Marissa asked who was involved or why the conversation needed to happen so late. No dramatic confession arrived. Instead, the discomfort grew through tiny inconsistencies, each one easy to explain alone and much harder to ignore when placed beside the others. Marissa kept talking herself out of the worst possibility because accepting such a possibility meant facing a question she was not ready to answer. If Edward was hiding someone else, what exactly had she been fighting to save? Her restraint also came from guilt and uncertainty. Edward had told her more than once he felt like an outsider inside her world, especially when family opinions entered their disagreements. He believed private problems became group discussions, and he felt pressure from people who already had strong views about him. Marissa did not agree with every complaint, but she understood why he felt worn down. Part of her wondered if his secrecy around work came from wanting one area of life free from interrogation. Another part feared she was reading ordinary distance as proof of something darker because their trust had already been damaged. Then, a piece of paper removed much of the comfort from those explanations. Marissa finds a restaurant receipt connected to a date Edward had described as business. The receipt shows 2 dinners and a bottle of wine, and suddenly the story in her head changes shape. This is no longer a vague phone call or a notification disappearing before she sees the name. A physical record now sits in her hands, tied to a specific night and tied to an explanation which no longer feels complete. She studies the receipt long enough for every detail to become impossible to forget. 2 meals and a bottle of wine appear beside a date when she believed Edward was meeting a professional contact. The paper looks ordinary, yet what the receipt represents lands hard. She still does not rush into the confrontation screaming. By this point, anger is mixed with fear, because she knows one answer might destroy the last version of their marriage she still trusts. When she finally brings the receipt to Edward, his reaction does not give her the relief she wants. He admits he was with another woman, He does not describe the meeting as romantic, and he insists the woman is someone he became close to while discussing professional opportunities and personal stress. According to Edward, the connection grew during a period when he felt isolated and needed someone outside the marriage to talk with. In his version, the dinner is not proof of an affair. The dinner reflects a friendship he handled badly and chose to keep private. For a moment, Marissa has to process the strange split between relief and betrayal. Edward has not confessed to a physical relationship, yet he has admitted enough to confirm her instincts were not invented. Another woman exists. The late conversations now have a possible explanation. The guarded phone no longer feels random, and the restaurant receipt no longer stands alone. Even if Edward's description is accurate, Marissa is left with a different problem because emotional closeness hidden behind false explanations still carries consequences inside a marriage already struggling with trust. The question which changes the confrontation is not about the dinner itself. Marissa asks why he lied about where he was and who he was meeting. Edward tries to explain the secrecy as an attempt to avoid another argument, saying he expected Marissa to misunderstand the friendship and feared every conversation would become evidence against him. From his point of view, hiding the meeting prevented unnecessary conflict. From hers, hiding the meeting created the exact suspicion he claims he wanted to avoid. If the friendship was harmless, why did the truth need protection? If no romantic line was crossed, why was Marissa given a different story before she ever knew another woman was involved? Edward does not offer an answer strong enough to settle her. He talks about pressure, exhaustion, and the state of their marriage, but every explanation seems to move around the same missing piece. He chose to conceal the dinner before Marissa confronted him. Nobody forced him to invent a cleaner version of the night, and nobody forced him to become protective of conversations he once treated casually. Marissa does not need a dramatic confession to understand her trust has shifted. The issue is no longer whether one receipt proves an affair. The issue is whether Edward has been managing two separate versions of his life, one he shares with his wife and another he keeps outside her view. Edward sees the conversation as painful but survivable. He has admitted the woman exists, denied a romantic relationship, and explained why he kept the friendship private. In his mind, the worst misunderstanding has been dragged into the open, which means they now have something concrete to argue about instead of living inside suspicion. He expects anger, more questions, and another conversation about the dinner the next morning. What he does not expect is the silence which follows, because Marissa stops pressing him and begins watching much more carefully. She no longer demands access to his phone, or turns every late arrival into another fight. Her tone changes in a way Edward reads as exhaustion. She starts listening more carefully than she speaks, storing dates, explanations, charges, and details without announcing her new approach. The emotional temperature inside the house seems lower, yet the calm is misleading. Marissa has reached a point where another argument feels useless because she no longer trusts words to settle anything. If Edward says the relationship is professional, she wants records which support the story. If he says the strange calls mean nothing, she wants to understand why the same pattern keeps returning. Marissa begins collecting information quietly, looking back at dates which once seemed ordinary, calls she previously ignored, charges she never questioned, and explanations she accepted because marriage requires some level of faith. There is no satisfaction in feeling suspicious. Every detail she saves carries the possibility of proving her fear wrong, while the same detail also carries the possibility of confirming something far worse than one secret dinner. Marissa is no longer asking herself whether Edward met another woman because she already knows the answer. Now she is trying to understand how long the connection existed, how deeply the relationship reached into their marriage, and how many times she accepted a story designed to stop the next question. Across the room, Edward believes the immediate crisis has passed. The receipt has been explained, the confrontation has cooled, and Marissa is no longer pressing him every few minutes. He mistakes her silence for emotional fatigue, when in truth she has stopped arguing because she has changed methods. She is no longer asking Edward to convince her, because Marissa has started preparing to let the record speak for him. Marissa does not confront Edward again after the restaurant receipt because something inside her has shifted from anger into caution. She has heard his explanation, watched him defend the friendship, and listened while he described the secrecy as a way to avoid conflict, yet the answer leaves more questions behind than relief. Instead of pushing him into another argument, she starts following the details already sitting around their marriage, and the first pattern she notices comes from the phone records. The same number appears again and again, sometimes at ordinary hours, sometimes late enough to make the timing harder to dismiss, and every repeated call leads back to the same woman Edward described as a professional connection. At first, Marissa refuses to treat frequency as proof of romance because people speak often for many reasons, especially when work and personal stress begin mixing together. She knows suspicion becomes dangerous once every innocent detail starts looking guilty, so she keeps reminding herself of what she does not know. She has no confession of an affair, no clear record proving where every meeting happened, and no single message revealing the full nature of the relationship. Still, the pattern refuses to disappear. The calls continue across dates connected to arguments at home, business explanations, and nights when Edward seemed emotionally distant, leaving Marissa with the uncomfortable feeling that another person has been present inside their marriage without ever stepping through the front door. Then the financial records begin adding another layer. Marissa notices hotel-related charges near places Edward had connected to meetings and professional obligations, and once again nothing on the page proves exactly what happened behind any closed door. A hotel charge does not automatically mean betrayal, especially when business travel and meetings remain part of Edward's explanation, yet those expenses become harder for Marissa to separate from the repeated calls and the dinner receipt. Each piece has an innocent explanation when viewed alone, but the emotional weight changes once those pieces start landing beside one another. Marissa finds herself going back through dates she once accepted without hesitation. A night Edward said work ran late now sits beside a call to the same woman. Another business explanation sits close to a charge she never questioned at the time. A message arrives with wording Marissa feels carries more warmth than ordinary professional contact. Then another follows with a tone she reads as personal rather than practical. Nothing gives her the clean answer she wants, and perhaps the uncertainty hurts almost as much as certainty would, because she keeps moving between two possibilities. Either Edward crossed a serious boundary, or their marriage has become so damaged that even innocent explanations no longer feel believable. Edward begins noticing the distance before he understands its source. Marissa is quieter around him, less interested in repeating old arguments, and far less willing to discuss the future with the confidence she once showed. He senses her pulling away and begins making more effort toward the marriage, speaking about fixing what has gone wrong and trying to move their conversations away from suspicion. From his side, the relationship still appears damaged but reparable. He does not behave like someone who believes everything ended long ago, and this becomes one of the hardest contradictions for Marissa to process. While Edward talks about rebuilding, Marissa is sitting with records suggesting he created a private emotional space with someone else during the same period. When he speaks about their future, she hears the words differently because she is still trying to understand his recent past. She watches him make attempts to reconnect while remembering the phone calls he never mentioned. She listens to him describe the marriage as something worth saving while thinking about the restaurant dinner he originally hid. The contrast becomes exhausting because part of her still recognizes the man trying to repair their relationship, while another part no longer knows whether his effort arrived before or after he realized she had become suspicious. There is another uncomfortable possibility Marissa cannot dismiss. Edward might mean everything he says about wanting the marriage to survive. A person might hide an emotional connection and still love a spouse. A person might make selfish choices without secretly planning an exit. Those possibilities do not clear Edward, but they stop Marissa from turning the situation into an easy story with one villain and one victim. Their marriage had problems before the other woman entered the picture. Edward felt isolated. Marissa felt emotionally drained. Money fights had worn them down, and family involvement had made private disagreements feel larger. None of those pressures excuse deception, yet they help explain why both people now seem to be living inside different versions of the same relationship. Marissa eventually speaks with a divorce attorney, but she does not walk into that conversation already committed to ending the marriage. She wants information because uncertainty has started controlling too much of her life. She wants to understand what leaving would involve, what staying might cost emotionally, and whether secrecy alone has become serious enough to make trust impossible. The conversation does not give her instant clarity. Instead, she leaves carrying another difficult truth, because learning what divorce looks like forces her to consider a future without Edward in a more concrete way than she is before. For a period, she still does not file. She keeps moving between anger and hesitation, especially whenever Edward shows signs of wanting to repair what remains. Some moments make her remember why she stayed. Other moments bring the hidden dinner back into focus. She thinks about his explanation of emotional support and wonders whether she is punishing him for needing someone to talk with during a painful period. Then she remembers he did not tell her about the woman voluntarily, and the question returns with more force. If the relationship stayed within acceptable boundaries, why did honesty arrive only after evidence forced the conversation? Another record finally pushes Marissa beyond the point where waiting feels useful. The detail does not suddenly prove every fear she has carried, but it strengthens the pattern she has been struggling to explain away. Repeated contact, concealed meetings, hotel-related charges, intimate-sounding language, and Edward's original lie about the dinner now sit together in one timeline. Marissa stops asking whether any single item proves a full affair because her decision is no longer resting on one item. For her, the larger issue has become concealment, and she no longer believes trust will return through explanations delivered only after she finds something first. She files for divorce. When Edward learns what she has done, his reaction is not calm acceptance from someone who believed the marriage had already ended. He is stunned because, from his perspective, they were still trying to save the relationship. The filing feels abrupt to him, even though Marissa has been emotionally moving toward the decision for weeks. He sees the conversations about repair, the attempts to reconnect, and the fact that neither one had openly declared the marriage finished. Marissa sees the same period differently because she spent those weeks finding information Edward never volunteered. That difference becomes central once both sides begin preparing for court. Marissa's attorney views the evidence as more than isolated mistakes and starts arranging the calls, charges, messages, and hidden dinner into a broader pattern of concealment. The argument focuses less on proving one dramatic act and more on showing how Edward allowed Marissa to make emotional and financial decisions while she lacked information about a relationship affecting their marriage. From Marissa's side, the secrecy matters because informed trust becomes impossible when one person controls which facts the other person gets to see. Edward's side pushes back against the interpretation. His position stays consistent. He admits hiding the friendship and accepts that concealing the dinner damaged trust, but he denies the evidence proves a full physical affair. Frequent calls do not reveal what every conversation contained. Hotel-related charges do not establish who was present. Warm messages do not automatically establish a sexual relationship. His defense forces Marissa to confront the uncomfortable gap between what she strongly suspects and what the records truly establish. For Edward, the case begins feeling like every ambiguous detail from a failing marriage is being placed under the darkest possible interpretation. For Marissa, the same evidence feels like a map of all the moments when her instincts warned her something was wrong and she chose to trust him anyway. Neither interpretation fits neatly inside a single receipt or phone record, which is why the upcoming testimony starts becoming more important than either side expected. Then Marissa learns the woman herself is expected to testify. Until this point, the other woman has existed through numbers, charges, dates, messages, and Edward's explanations. Marissa has been able to study the evidence without facing the person connected to all of it, which has allowed some emotional distance from what she fears happened. Now the distance is disappearing because the woman at the center of Edward's hidden friendship is preparing to sit inside the same courtroom and answer questions neither phone records nor receipts were able to settle. For weeks, Marissa has been fighting paper. Soon, she will have to look directly at the person behind every unanswered question. The courtroom feels different the moment the woman walks through the door. Until now, Marissa has been dealing with records, dates, charges, and messages, pieces of a story she has been forced to assemble without ever seeing the person connected to them. Now there is a face attached to every late call, every uneasy explanation, and every night Edward insisted work had kept him away longer than expected. Marissa watches her approach the witness area with a calm expression, yet inside, she is trying to prepare for answers she has spent weeks fearing. Across the room, Edward shifts in his seat, lowers his eyes, and suddenly looks far less comfortable than he did when attorneys were arguing over paperwork. The woman begins carefully because every word now carries weight. She does not describe herself as someone who set out to damage a marriage, and she does not present Edward as a man secretly planning a second life from the beginning. She explains how their conversations started around professional matters before becoming more personal over time. Edward spoke about feeling lonely inside his marriage, especially during periods when arguments with Marissa became frequent and unresolved. He talked about money disagreements, tension involving her family, and his growing belief that almost every choice he made ended up being examined by people whose approval he never felt he fully earned. Listening to those details becomes painful for Marissa in a way she was not prepared for, because these are not random complaints Edward shared with a stranger. These are private pieces of their marriage, arguments she remembers having inside rooms where she believed only two people were involved. She hears the woman describe moments Edward felt dismissed, misunderstood, and emotionally isolated, and each detail forces Marissa to confront something larger than the hidden dinner. Edward did not only share time with someone else. He shared the inside of their relationship with her, including frustrations Marissa thought belonged between husband and wife. The testimony does not suddenly erase Edward's side of the story. Their marriage had become exhausting long before the restaurant receipt appeared. Family pressure had left him feeling watched. Financial stress had made ordinary disagreements heavier. He believed Marissa sometimes listened to outside opinions before hearing his side, and the woman says those frustrations came up often during their conversations. Hearing this does not excuse his secrecy, but the emotional connection starts making more sense. Edward had found someone who listened when he felt nobody inside his marriage was hearing him, and over time, the line between support and attachment became harder to define. For Marissa, this explanation creates another kind of hurt because Edward was telling her they still had something worth repairing during the same period. He was talking about rebuilding trust at home while privately describing the marriage as a place where he felt trapped, judged, and alone. She starts wondering which version reflected what he felt most deeply. Was he trying to save the relationship with Marissa while using another woman as emotional shelter, or was he keeping Marissa close because he had not decided what he wanted? The records never answered this, and the woman sitting only a few feet away suddenly feels closer to the truth than any document Marissa has studied. The questioning grows more direct. Marissa's attorney asks how often they spoke, whether the conversation stayed focused on work, and whether Edward discussed his future with Marissa. The woman admits their conversations became personal enough for her to understand how unhappy he felt during some periods of the marriage. She knew about arguments Marissa never expected anyone else to hear about. She knew Edward felt pressure from family involvement. She knew he worried about money and believed his efforts were constantly being measured against standards he struggled to satisfy. Marissa keeps her eyes forward, but her expression changes as each private detail enters the public record. The pain is no longer tied only to whether Edward touched another woman. Emotional privacy has already been broken. He gave someone else access to fears, frustrations, and doubts he often struggled to explain directly to his wife. Even worse for Marissa, this closeness grew while she was still making decisions under the belief that both of them were trying to repair their marriage from inside the same reality. Then, the questioning reaches the issue everyone in the room knows has been waiting underneath every other detail. Marissa's attorney asks whether the relationship ever became romantic. The woman does not answer immediately. For Marissa, the hesitation lands before any words follow. Edward keeps his eyes lowered, and the silence stretches long enough for the entire mood inside the courtroom to change. A quick denial would have given Marissa something solid to process. Instead, the pause suggests there is a boundary nobody has spoken about yet, and she watches Edward closely because his reaction now matters almost as much as the answer. The woman finally admits she and Edward kissed once. Edward looks down toward the table. Marissa does not need another explanation to understand why his reaction hurts. He had denied crossing any romantic line. He had described the connection as emotional support and professional closeness, something hidden because he feared Marissa would misunderstand. Now the woman has confirmed a kiss, and the issue in Marissa's mind immediately moves away from whether one kiss qualifies as a full affair. Her focus lands on the fact Edward had already been asked about the nature of the relationship and chose not to tell her this part. The woman remains firm about the limits of what happened. She says there was no full physical affair and insists the kiss happened once. Edward's attorney leans heavily on this distinction because the court has heard accusations shaped by phone calls, hotel-related charges, emotional messages, and hidden meetings. From his side, the testimony does not prove the larger physical relationship Marissa feared. One kiss is still a crossed boundary, yet it is not proof of every suspicion surrounding every unexplained charge or late-night conversation. Marissa understands the legal distinction, but emotionally the difference offers almost no comfort. She was not asking whether Edward maintained a months-long physical relationship when she first confronted him. She wanted honesty about where the connection had gone. Edward allowed her to believe no romantic boundary had been crossed, even after she found the receipt and gave him a direct chance to explain. The kiss now matters because it exposes a second layer of concealment. First, he hid the woman. Then, after admitting she existed, he still kept part of the truth outside Marissa's reach. Edward finally tries to explain what happened around the kiss. He describes that period of the marriage as one of their lowest points. He felt isolated, arguments were becoming more frequent, and he believed every attempt to explain his frustration ended with another fight. During one emotionally weak moment, the friendship crossed a line he says he regretted soon after. He insists he did not build a secret physical relationship with the woman, and he points to the fact he stayed with Marissa rather than leaving after the kiss. There is something painful in his explanation because his regret does not sound empty to Marissa, yet regret is not the same as honesty. If he regretted the kiss, she wonders why he did not tell her when she confronted him. If staying meant he chose the marriage, why did he keep communicating with the woman instead of closing the emotional connection? Edward sees remaining in the marriage as evidence of commitment. Marissa hears the same argument and reaches a completely different conclusion. When she finally responds, her voice carries less anger than Edward expects. She tells him the deepest wound is not only the kiss. From her point of view, he stayed in the marriage while keeping another emotional possibility alive. She says he did not remain because he had fully chosen her. He remained while another option stayed open beside them, hidden behind professional explanations, private calls, and conversations Marissa was never supposed to see. The statement lands because it reaches the fear underneath every receipt and phone record. Marissa has not spent weeks trying to prove Edward is some heartless man who never cared about her. His own behavior makes the situation more confusing, because he did keep trying to save the marriage. He did speak about their future. He did appear hurt when she filed. Yet the testimony now suggests his emotional life was divided during the same period, and Marissa no longer knows whether his efforts came from love, guilt, fear of losing the marriage, or uncertainty about which relationship he wanted. For several minutes, the case appears to have turned decisively against Edward. The woman has confirmed the kiss, his earlier denial has been weakened, and Marissa's argument about concealment now carries more weight than it did when the evidence consisted mainly of patterns and suspicion. Edward sits quietly while his attorney prepares to respond, and Marissa seems to believe the most difficult revelation of the day has already happened. Then Edward's attorney introduces a new set of messages. The focus shifts away from Edward's phone and toward Marissa's own private communications. The records show she contacted a divorce attorney months before learning about Edward's relationship with the other woman. The timing matters because Marissa has described herself as someone still trying to preserve the marriage while Edward secretly moved closer to somebody else. Now the court learns she had already started exploring what leaving might look like before the restaurant receipt, before the phone records, and before the kiss became known. Edward turns toward her with an expression Marissa has not seen all day. The discomfort on his face gives way to shock because this information does not fit the version of their marriage he believed he understood. He thought they were struggling, arguing, and hurting each other while still trying to stay together. He knew Marissa was unhappy, yet he did not know she had already spoken with someone about divorce. Marissa does not deny the contact. And for the first time since the woman entered the courtroom, Edward is no longer the only person being forced to explain a secret. He looks directly at Marissa now, no longer avoiding her eyes, because the question has shifted across the room. He has spent the hearing answering for what he concealed from his wife, and suddenly he wants to know what she had already been preparing to hide from him. The balance inside the courtroom changes almost instantly. Only moments earlier, Edward was the one answering for hidden meetings, private calls, and a kiss he never admitted to Marissa. Now his attention stays fixed on her, because the messages introduced by his attorney reveal something he never expected to hear in open court. Months before Marissa found the restaurant receipt, before she studied the phone records, and before she learned another woman had become emotionally close to her husband, Marissa had already spoken with a divorce attorney. Edward does not treat the revelation as a minor detail. For him, those messages raise a painful question about who had started preparing for the end first. Edward argues Marissa has spent the hearing describing herself as the spouse who kept believing in their marriage while he secretly built an emotional connection elsewhere. From his perspective, her contact with a divorce attorney complicates that picture. He knew their relationship was struggling. He knew money arguments, family pressure, and unresolved resentment had damaged both of them. What he says he did not know was that Marissa had already gone far enough to ask a lawyer what leaving him might involve. To Edward, this means she had a private exit conversation of her own while expecting complete openness from him. Marissa does not deny speaking with the attorney, and her admission removes any possibility of dismissing the messages as a misunderstanding. She explains that she reached a point where the marriage felt emotionally exhausting, and she wanted information before making a decision she might regret. She had not filed at that stage. She had not told Edward the marriage was over. According to Marissa, speaking with a lawyer gave her a clearer sense of what divorce would mean if their problems kept getting worse. Part of her was frightened enough to explore leaving, while another part still wanted their marriage to recover. Edward struggles with that explanation because he sees a contradiction. Marissa is asking the court to view his hidden friendship as proof of divided commitment, yet she had privately explored divorce before learning about the other woman. He argues that both spouses kept significant information away from each other during the same troubled period. He hid a friendship because he feared another fight. Marissa hid a legal consultation because she feared where the marriage was heading. In Edward's view, secrecy did not exist on only one side of the relationship, and the court should not pretend their breakdown began with him alone. For a moment, his argument carries emotional weight because Marissa knows their marriage was already in trouble. The other woman did not create every wound between them. She did not create the financial fights, the family tension, or Edward's growing belief that he never fully belonged in Marissa's world. Those problems were already present. Marissa had reached such a low point that she sought legal advice before discovering the hidden dinner, which means thoughts of divorce existed before any romantic boundary involving Edward became known. Yet Marissa refuses to accept Edward's attempt to place the two choices on equal ground. She explains that asking a lawyer about divorce was not the same as developing an intimate connection with another person, kissing her, then denying any romantic line had been crossed. Marissa never claims she was fully happy during those months. She never claims leaving had never crossed her mind. Her point is narrower and more painful. She considered ending the marriage because she felt exhausted, but she did not secretly begin another romantic connection while asking Edward to believe they were rebuilding trust. The disagreement becomes harder because both sides are describing actions rooted in fear, yet the actions are different. Edward feared confrontation and hid the friendship. Marissa feared the marriage was collapsing and privately learned about divorce. One spouse searched for emotional support outside the relationship. The other searched for legal information about ending the relationship. Neither choice reflects a healthy marriage, though the court still has to decide what each choice means rather than blending them together simply because both involved secrecy. The judge eventually interrupts before the argument turns into another replay of every grievance from their marriage. The warning is firm. Years of disappointment, family conflict, money stress, private resentment, and emotional neglect are being pulled into a legal hearing where the court still needs facts. The judge makes clear that the hearing cannot become a competition over who hurt first or who suffered more. The kiss matters. The hidden friendship matters. Marissa's earlier legal consultation matters. None of those details automatically settle every question now before the court. Then the focus moves toward money, and the tension changes again. Marissa's attorney introduces several expenses linked to dates and locations associated with Edward's meetings with the other woman. Some charges appear near places Edward described as business-related, and the records raise another concern because at least part of the spending appears connected to shared finances. Until this moment, most of the case has centered on emotional trust. Now Marissa has to consider whether money belonging to both spouses was used during meetings Edward kept hidden from her. The accusation lands differently because financial secrecy carries its own kind of damage. Marissa had already spent weeks looking at records and asking herself whether Edward's explanations matched what she found. Now those same records create another question. If shared money helped cover dinners, travel-related expenses, or other costs tied to meetings with the woman, then Marissa feels the concealment reached beyond private conversations. From her perspective, she might have unknowingly helped fund moments she was never meant to know existed. Edward reacts strongly to that interpretation. He rejects any suggestion that he financed an affair through their joint money. He insists most of the expenses were ordinary business costs and argues that Marissa's attorney is placing unrelated transactions beside the hidden friendship in order to make the pattern appear more damaging. A charge near a meeting location does not prove the woman was present. A hotel-related expense does not establish a romantic encounter. Edward keeps returning to the same point his attorney raised earlier. Suspicious timing is not the same as proof. Marissa's side answers that the concern comes from the accumulation of details rather than one isolated purchase. The restaurant receipt was originally described as business before Edward admitted another woman joined him. Repeated calls followed. Messages became more personal. A kiss was later confirmed after Edward denied romantic contact. Against that history, Marissa no longer feels comfortable accepting every expense at face value simply because Edward labels the charge professional. The judge refuses to adopt either interpretation without fuller documentation. Rather than treating the expenses as proven misuse or dismissing them as harmless business costs, the court orders a more complete accounting before financial division moves forward. The decision means bank records, dates, charges, and supporting information will receive closer examination. For Marissa and Edward, the order guarantees the legal conflict will not end inside this hearing. Their finances now require the same painful scrutiny already applied to their marriage. Edward looks frustrated because he believes suspicion has started swallowing every part of his life. A hidden friendship has led to questions about his work, his spending, his phone records, and his honesty across months of marriage. He does not deny making mistakes. He does not deny hiding the dinner. He no longer denies the kiss. Yet he resists the idea that every unclear charge should now be treated as another piece of betrayal. Marissa hears his frustration, but her anger begins fading into something colder. The financial arguments continue around her, attorneys move through records, and Edward keeps defending the difference between what looks suspicious and what has been proven. Marissa no longer seems interested in winning every point. Her expression changes because the hearing has pushed her beyond the question of whether one side has the stronger argument. She has heard the other woman describe Edward's loneliness. She has admitted her own thoughts about divorce. She has watched private wounds become courtroom evidence. Somewhere during all of this, her need to prove herself right starts disappearing. Her hand moves toward her wedding ring. Edward notices before anyone says a word. Marissa slowly removes the ring she has worn through arguments, promises, doubts, and every attempt to convince herself the marriage still had enough trust left to repair. The gesture is quiet, though Edward's reaction shows how loudly he understands the meaning. Their attorneys are still working. The financial accounting is unfinished. Legal decisions remain ahead of them. Yet Edward suddenly sees that the part of this fight he cares about most might already be slipping beyond any ruling. He turns toward Marissa and asks her not to throw away their future over one mistake. His words are emotional because he still sees the kiss as a terrible moment inside a marriage already falling apart, not as proof that every feeling he had for Marissa disappeared. He stayed. He tried to repair the relationship. He regretted crossing the boundary. To Edward, those facts still mean something. Marissa looks at him with none of the anger she carried earlier. Her answer is quieter, which makes the meaning harder to escape. The kiss is not why she wants the divorce. The lie afterward is. Marissa slips the wedding ring from her finger, and something in Edward finally gives way. For most of the hearing, he has sat through accusations, phone records, testimony, financial questions, and the revelation of the kiss, while trying to keep some control over his face. Now the ring is resting in Marissa's hand, and the legal arguments around them suddenly seem smaller than the meaning of that gesture. Edward looks at her as if he understands, perhaps for the first time, that the marriage is no longer hanging on what the judge decides. The court still has paperwork to review, money to examine, and facts to sort out, but Marissa is making an emotional decision no order from the bench will reverse for her. Edward tries to explain himself again, yet his voice carries more strain now. He insists there is a difference between wanting another woman and making one terrible choice during one of the lowest periods of their marriage. He says the kiss happened when he felt lonely, angry, and disconnected, but he never built a new life with the woman and never stopped caring about Marissa. In his mind, staying in the marriage matters because he had opportunities to walk away and did not take them. He kept returning home, kept talking about fixing their future, and kept hoping the damage between them was still irreparable. Marissa hears him, but she no longer looks interested in arguing over the definition of betrayal. The kiss has become only one piece of something much larger. She remembers the guarded phone, the late calls, and the conversations disappearing before she had a chance to understand who was contacting him. She remembers the nights when work supposedly ran late, followed by details that did not quite match what she learned afterward. Then came the restaurant receipt, 2 meals and wine on a night Edward had described as business, followed by his admission that another woman had been sitting across the table from him. What troubles Marissa most is not one romantic moment. Her trust was damaged in stages. First, Edward allowed her to believe there was nothing unusual about the late communication. Then he hid the dinner. When she finally confronted him with evidence, he admitted the woman existed, but described the relationship as professional support mixed with friendship. Even after Marissa gave him a direct chance to tell her whether any romantic line had been crossed, he still left out the kiss. The truth did not arrive freely. Every new piece appeared only after another record, another question, or another person forced the missing detail into the open. That pattern is what Marissa keeps returning to, because one mistake followed by immediate honesty might have created a different conversation. Instead, each explanation seemed complete until something else exposed another missing piece. The calls meant little until the receipt appeared. The dinner seemed less threatening until the messages showed greater emotional closeness. The friendship seemed easier to understand until the woman testified. Then the kiss revealed that Edward's earlier denial had not been the full truth. By the time he asks Marissa to judge him by one bad moment, she no longer believes the marriage fell apart in one moment at all. Edward does have a point that makes the situation harder to reduce into a simple story. Their marriage was already deeply strained before Marissa found evidence of the other woman. She had contacted a divorce attorney months earlier, which means thoughts of leaving were already present in her mind. She was exhausted enough to seek legal information, even while the two of them were still living as husband and wife. Edward's loneliness was not something he invented after the relationship became public. He had complained about feeling judged, pressured by family involvement, and worn down by arguments long before the courtroom forced him to defend himself. Those details matter because they show a marriage already cracking under pressure from several directions. Edward did not wake up one morning inside a peaceful relationship and suddenly decide to create chaos. Marissa did not begin thinking about divorce only because another woman appeared. Both of them had reached a point where home no longer felt emotionally safe in the way they once expected. Marissa began quietly researching an exit. Edward began leaning emotionally on someone outside the marriage. Neither choice fixed the problem sitting between them, and both choices created new secrets. Still, Marissa refuses to treat those secrets as equal. She admits she considered divorce because she was unsure whether the marriage had enough left to save, but she did not tell Edward she had recommitted while secretly crossing a romantic boundary somewhere else. From her point of view, Edward wants credit for staying without fully confronting what staying looked like. He remained married to Marissa while continuing a connection she knew nothing about, then denied the most intimate part of that connection when she finally asked. Edward keeps returning to the fact that the kiss happened once. He does not deny it anymore, and he does not appear proud of it. He says the moment was wrong. He regretted it, and he never intended for one lapse to become the final definition of their marriage. He wants Marissa to separate a weak decision from a long-term plan to replace her. In his eyes, those are different things, and he looks desperate for her to see the difference before she walks away for good. Marissa seems to understand what he is saying, but understanding is no longer enough. A marriage does not survive on technical distinctions when the basic sense of safety has disappeared. She does not need proof that Edward planned a full future with someone else. She does not need another hotel charge or another phone record to decide how she feels. What she needed from him was honesty when she gave him the opportunity to tell the truth, and the testimony has shown her that he still held something back. The judge eventually brings the hearing back to the matters still unresolved. Questions surrounding the expenses will require further accounting before the financial division moves ahead. The available records raise concerns, yet they do not settle which charges were legitimate business costs and which, if any, were connected to Edward's hidden meetings with the woman. More documentation will be reviewed, which means the legal process is not ending today, even though the emotional direction of the marriage appears far clearer. For Edward, this creates a painful split. On paper, there is still more to fight about. There are finances to trace, explanations to provide, and legal decisions that remain open. Across the table, though, Marissa has already removed the symbol that told him they were still husband and wife. He watches her place the ring away, and the controlled expression he carried through most of the hearing finally disappears. Edward breaks down because he no longer seems to be defending himself only against an accusation. He is watching the consequence arrive. He tells Marissa he stayed because he loved her, not because he was waiting for someone better. He insists the other woman became close to him during a period when he felt isolated, but he never stopped hoping his marriage would recover. For perhaps the first time during the hearing, his argument sounds less like a legal defense and more like a husband trying to stop a door from closing. Marissa does not celebrate his pain, and she does not look satisfied by seeing him fall apart. Her own face carries the exhaustion of someone who spent too long hoping one final explanation would make everything easier to understand. She tells him again that the kiss is not the reason she wants the divorce. What broke something inside her was the lie after the kiss, because he had the opportunity to tell her the truth and still decided she should know only part of it. She begins preparing to leave, and for a moment, the story appears to have reached its end. Edward is left sitting with the consequences of what he concealed. Marissa is walking away from a marriage she once hesitated to abandon. The other woman has already admitted the kiss. The court has ordered further financial review. Nothing feels clean, and nobody walks out looking completely untouched by the choices made before this hearing. Then the woman who testified approaches Edward's attorney. She speaks quietly and reveals there is one message that has not yet been discussed. The message was sent by Edward the night before Marissa filed for divorce, which makes the timing impossible to ignore. Marissa had not yet ended the marriage on paper. Edward had not yet been served with the decision that shocked him. Whatever was happening inside his mind that night happened before he knew she was about to leave. The message contains only one line. Tomorrow, I finally have to choose. Suddenly, every explanation from the hearing feels less settled than it did moments earlier. Edward has spent the day insisting he remained because he loved Marissa and wanted their marriage to survive. The woman has described an emotional connection that crossed at least one romantic boundary. Marissa has argued that Edward kept another option open while staying married. Now there is a message suggesting Edward himself believed some kind of choice had reached a deadline. The message does not say who he planned to choose, and there is no honest way to fill in the missing answer. He might have been preparing to end the connection with the other woman and fully recommit to Marissa. He might have been preparing to tell Marissa their marriage was over. He might already have reached a decision before her divorce filing arrived and changed the entire direction of the story. The words reveal pressure, but they do not reveal the destination. And that unanswered line leaves the hardest question hanging over everything Marissa and Edward have said. Which betrayal matters more to you? The kiss itself, or the decision to hide the truth afterward? And when Edward wrote, "Tomorrow, I finally have to choose," who do you believe he was preparing to choose, Marissa or the other woman?